Well, hello everyone. Welcome back to the Honest Pod. Today, you guys are going to get this in a few days, but today when I'm recording this is actually Ash Wednesday, which I just think is so perfect for who I have on today. And I don't know if you guys follow Ash Wednesday or how you feel about the Lenten season, but for me, I feel like the Lenten season is just about being very honest about where you are and where God has you. And and just this like deepening reality of from dust we have come and dust we will return. And yet, what do we do in the messy middle of all of that? And so today I get to have my new friend, Strahan Coleman, on with us today. Strahan, you can say hi to all the Honest Pod people.
Kia ora, friends. It is great to be with you all today. I'm very excited about this.
So you can tell by his accent that he's not, well, I mean, you could be from here, but you are not from here. So where do we find you on this blistering hot day for you and freezing cold day for me?
yeah. Yeah, so I live in Aotearoa, New Zealand, which is otherwise known as Hobbiton, far corner of the world. You might have seen us in the Lord of the Rings movies and all of that. It's where I live. It is astoundingly beautiful, and it just so happens to be very hot today. Yes, so I'm feeling for you over there in the cold, Karrie. But I live in a small beach town called
Yeah.
Tairua, which is just about 1,500 people, white sand, luxurious beaches. It is one of the most beautiful places on earth. I'm very blessed.
Man, you dropped one of my favorite lines. I am a Lord of the Rings weirdo, and I love the
Oh,
Lord of the Rings
awesome.
to the place to where my husband is like, this has gotten ridiculous, Karrie. I'm like, it is our life. I am Frodo. So the fact that you live there is just very cool. Let me tell you guys a little bit about who Strahan is. He's a musician and a writer and a spiritual director, and he writes poetic poetry for Commoners Communion, and he wrote a new book called Beholding, which we're going to get into today. But I want you guys to know why I picked a guy from New Zealand to come on this beautiful, amazing podcast to bless all of you, and you are going to be blessed. So I was listening to a podcast with John Mark Comer, who we all just love, and I was listening to this man's story and the birthing of something actually really beautiful out of a lot of pain. And now I don't know your full story, Strahan, but I do know I am referring to when your body was sick and what was going on, in that season. And I mean, just reading about it, and then listening about it was like, man, like, I think so many people can relate to, I think we just can relate far more to hardship, to be honest with you, than we even can joy. There's something really viscerally human about the brokenness of our body, the finality of our humanity, like how fragile it really is. And not to put a pretty bow on it, but really what grows in the dirt, of what. And so I would love for you to just tell me a little bit about who you are and what has inspired you in some of the work that you're doing now. So where do we kind of find you in this journey of where you are today?
Yeah. So, I mean, I just wholeheartedly agree with what you're saying. First of all, I mean, suffering and struggle and trial and darkness is not our favorite themes for, the Sunday morning gatherings. And I think even today, even though I think our culture shifted a bit, we still struggle, I think, to really honestly and openly talk about things in ways that don't feel like we always finish the sentence with, oh, but it's all good or whatever. So, and yet it is the most common human
Right.
experience, isn't it? And so I think I'm so with you there. But who I am, where I am, I mean, I am a musician by trade. I'm an artist. So I think that, I think as I've got older, I've realized music isn't just something I do. It's just part of the mechanics of my being. I see the world that way and experience the world and experience God that way. Um, but I have, as you mentioned, have had this sort of long journey with chronic illness. I've been wrestling with various forms of sickness for about 10 years, largely undiagnosed. And I think that that's played a pretty significant role in shaping who I am and my experience of life and of God. And I guess part of that process has been a shift from music, which was my primary sort of um, vocation, into writing and talking and discussing a lot more about prayer and spirituality with people, and exploring, as you say, sort of poetic prayers, and writing this book, Beholding, but really just wanting to. I think what I desire and what is in me is to help reshape what we mean when we say the word prayer to be something more vast, more embodied, in some ways more transcendent, but in others more ordinary and earthed and soiled in the sort of mess and substance of our lives. And so I kind of run prayer schools and engage with people on that level. So yeah, it's been a journey, but I think in both
Mm.
of those things, when I think about it, prayer and music are two very similar things. They're both highly tangible and very ethereal. They're both sort of at one place they're naming and expressing emotions and relationships and feelings, and in another way are completely ungraspable and very difficult to explain. They're
Mm.
experiential, and so I think in many ways that journey makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah.
Prayer is growing up. I think there was a point in my life, and I think there's a maybe this is true for a lot of people, is that um, prayer was something I needed to do because it was what I grew up doing. So you need to pray at dinner, you need to pray
Mm.
at church, you need to pray if someone's sick, pray. And it was really transactional, if I'm being honest. And then it got to the point where I remember saying to my dad one time, I said, why, if God already knows what's going to happen and he already has things like, not that we need to get into predestination, but like things predestined, but like he already knows what's going to happen, then I feel like I'm just like prayer is a waste of my time. It's a waste of like, he already knows. So I'm like, all right, God, I'll trust you. But why do I really need to pray? And does prayer change God's mind? Does it change
Mm.
his heart? Like, and those are deeper questions, but I just, for many years, especially in my early 30s, when I was encountering a lot, like my mom had committed suicide and there was a lot of
Mm.
things that I was sitting in. And so I'm like, did prayer, like I could have prayed for her healing and I did for years and she didn't get healed. And so there's a lot of those things where I think people wrestle with this idea of prayer, like what is it for and what does it really do? And I would love to get your take on your idea of what prayer is and why do we do it?
Mm. I mean, firstly, those are just amazing wrestles. And I imagine anyone listening has at least at one point in their life struggled with that very notion of what is the goal here? Because I think knowing the end point and knowing the purpose can make a big difference to our expectations and also things like disappointment and celebration. And most of us, I imagine, have prayed for serious things that matter deeply to us that have not come to pass. I mean, I've been sick 10 years. I'm still sick. I haven't been able to sing for the last 2 years. That's a prayer that hasn't been answered. And it's not just me praying for it. I know I got people, all over the country and the world praying for my health. So where's that? So for me, when I think of prayer, I think there's two elements of it. One, we need to recognize culturally what we bring to the table with God. And I think we're in a moment in history
Mm,
where one of the primary modes of our culture is to find answers and to fix things. So not a lot of cultures would have
mm,
seen that they would have convinced themselves that they had the power to overcome, say, sickness and disease, or to fly Europe, to overcome gravity in space. Our culture is defined by that, and we're very scientifically and enlightened mindedly think that everything is explainable, everything is an equation, everything can be rationalized. And there's nothing
mm,
necessarily wrong with that. But if we bring that to prayer, we can end up in this point where we treat God a little bit like a Google search engine, where his primary role is to
mm-hmm,
bring us mental and emotional, like rational security about things, to give us answers, to be easily understood. Whereas the early church and any kind of ancient culture understood you can't fully grasp God. He is mystery, and that's not to say he's unknowable. That's just one person said mystery doesn't mean you can't ever know it. Mystery is endless knowing. In other words, there's always more to know, and I love that.
mm,
So if we can understand that we're primarily approaching prayer as people that want answers, and then somehow come to God and say, what is the other option here? I would say that the other option is to know a person, to experience a person, and prayer is the place in which we relationally experience God. And therefore, the questions we ask may not be why questions; they might be more who questions. So
Mm.
I know for me in my own journey, for a number of years, my questions were, God, why am I not being healed? Um, where are you? Why am I praying and you're not answering? Why is my life falling apart? And I never got answers, never
Mm.
once got a single answer. To this day, not a single answer. Uh, but after time, I think what happened for me was I turned those why questions into who questions and was like, okay,
Mm.
who are you, God? Like, who really are you? And what does that mean for me? Because if you are good, that's a different kind of good than I thought. Because the kind of good I want is the good that's going to rush in, heal my body, fix my, financial situation, heal me up, send me out and sing again. And that's not what he was doing. And so what is prayer? Prayer is a place that we come to reckon with the mystery and magnitude and goodness and beauty and love of God. And sometimes that means that he responds to
Mm.
our prayers in tangible ways. Sometimes that means he doesn't, but he's not a genie we get to rub to get the things sorted that we need sorted. And somewhere in there, there's a profound tension of saying, I know when I pray, God will answer because he says so. But I also know when I pray, sometimes I'm not gonna see what I want to see, and there's mystery there, and it's for me in my humility to reckon
Mm.
with that. So I feel like that was a long, convoluted answer, but in some ways, I think what I'm saying is it's both. It is that I do think when we
Mhm.
pray, something shifts, and I think I've seen that in my life. I see it in scriptures. However, it would be wrong to say that God is sort of some kind of cosmic, slot machine that we pull the lever the right way, use the right words, say the right prayer, maybe fast at the right time, and suddenly we get the desired outcome. Because God isn't a machine like that. He's a person. So that's sort of how I've come to see
Right.
it.
Oh, it's so good. You said so many things that I think we could just sit and hold on. Even when you're talking, there is a sense of dropping into my body. So
Yeah.
there's so much of what, when we're talking about prayer or we're talking about, our relationship with God, we're so in our head about it and is so transactionally based of like,
Yeah.
okay, God, I'm going to pray this prayer and hopefully you're going to answer it the way that I don't. But even if you don't answer the way that I don't, to be a good Christian says that I have to go like, okay, well, God works all things for good for those who follow him,
Yeah.
and 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 what I hear you saying, and even as your tonality of your voice moves us into this place of the mystery of God in our bodies, like the presence of
Mm.
God embodied, yes, in our head, but also in these places of our body. And I
Yeah.
wonder if you would say that there is, and I know there's not a formula, but there are there ways, do you think that there are ways to approach the throne of God, to approach prayer in a way that allows you to be more present to what God might be saying, as opposed to
Mm.
like, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name? I mean, I pray that prayer quite a bit, but
Yeah.
um, is it a posture? Is it a mindset? Is it space? Is it what would you say are some of the
Mm.
fundamental elements or things that you think need to be there in order for us to start engaging prayer as more of embodiment rather than transactional?
Yeah. Lovely. I mean, I'd probably say three things. One, I believe the primary purpose of prayer is to be friends with God. It's friendship, it's dialogue, it's communion, it's
Mm.
union, as the saints would call it. And so I think there is something of like a theological premise that we have to have. And that premise is this, that through Christ, God has made his home in us. Like we are literally the home of God. And that is astounding. Like that should
Mm.
be, we talk about this a lot, but actually if we stop and think about what we're saying for a second, it is madness. For many, many hundreds of years, people built extravagant temples in an attempt to satisfy and house God. And Jesus comes along, sends us his spirit and says,
Mm.
no, I'm going to live in you. I'm going to abide in you. So I think for starters, I think that changes the premise of prayer, but I think it changes the way we pray, because what I'm doing when I'm coming to pray is I am sinking into my body, because my body is the place where God is. So I'm not trying to reach out into the
Hmm.
cosmos to find some external God who's distant and bring him in. What I'm trying to do is
Hmm.
awaken to the theological reality that I am some, Ephesians says we're raised and seated with Christ in heavenly places. God said, if you obey my commands and you love me, my Father will come to me and we will come and make our home in you. So we constantly see these references. So prayer is about stopping and first and foremost, just accepting this reality and welcoming it into our bodies. So, first thing would be prayer is about union and friendship with
Hmm.
God. Secondly, our bodies are the homes of God, and that changes, I think, the disposition in which we approach not just moments of prayer, but life. And then the third thing I would say is the saint, an old Russian saint, starets kind of hermit guy called Saint Theophan the Recluse, talked about prayer this way, and this is how they kind of have understood it in a historical way, that to pray we bring the mind down into the heart and we pray from there. And I really like that, because what it
Hmm.
does is it says the mind matters. The great commandment is love the Lord God, you God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. So the mind matters. We don't want to get out of our minds, but we don't want to get stuck in our minds either. And I'm a massive thinker, so I can go off. I can be in my mind for weeks before I even realize I'm
Yeah.
completely detached from
Same.
everything. And so my hardest thing is bringing it in. And so I love this image of not putting that away, but bringing it down into our hearts and saying, okay, my mind is good, but I'm going to bring those thoughts into the core of where my being is. In the ancient church, in the historical church, hearts aren't necessarily the seat of the emotions, so much that they are the heart is the seat of the soul of our being. And so
Hmm.
what it means is bring your mind and your thoughts down into your deep place of where in your body where you most are centered. um, Accept that God is already with you, and then begin to pray from this place of homedness, of acceptance, of saturation and love, and the dance and the pleasure of God. And if we pray from that place, everything changes. It takes practice, but to pray from that place, it changes your language, it changes your emotional state, it relaxes your body. It becomes a very embodied experience, because you're not trying to just get out of your body to be some kind of ethereal spirit with some imaginary thing somewhere up. You're earthed today in yourself, in God, where he loves to live. And I think for me, that's exciting. That changes everything, not just how I sit and pray, but how I play with my kids and how I do the dishes. And it changes everything. I think it's
Hmm.
a very beautiful vision.
Yeah, it's powerful. And there's my brain is going like, okay, where do I want what I have so many questions. Because and there's so many avenues that I want to go down, because I think this is it's a topic that we all know about in the idea of prayer. I mean, because that's just, if you're a believer, it kind of goes with the territory. But
Mm,
I think I have a few questions, but the first one that I have is in practicality. I'm like, okay, I love the idea of moving it from my head into my heart, into my body, into my soul.
mm.
How do I do that? Like
Yeah.
what? But I mean, we're busy. This world is crazy and everything. It feels like when I come before the Lord, there's like, I'm speaking on behalf of so many people, and I know kind of what I do in my life, but I'm curious for what you do, or maybe what you would offer as an invitation to. How do we begin to even do that? Move it from our head and this kind of transactional thing into our body. Like, how do we do that?
Mm. Well, there's a few ways to approach it, and it probably depends on personality and life experience and things like that. For me,
Mm-hmm.
I do I do it in a couple of different ways. Whenever I'm praying, so I'll sit in a chair like this, I might open my hands up on my palms, and I just start with deep breathing. I take a deep breath into my stomach,
Mm-hmm.
I hold it for 3 or 4 seconds, and I breathe out. And there's a lot in that biblically. For starters, we came into existence through the breath of God. Breath is central in the Old Testament. In fact, the word
Mm-hmm.
for breath and wind is actually the same word in much of the Old Testament and even some of the Latin in the New Testament too. So In other words, when we talk about the Spirit, sometimes we can talk about him as a wind and sometimes as a breath. So breathing is actually
Mm-hmm.
central to our humanity, and it's biblical. So I start with breathing, and then I just start to become aware of my surroundings. So one of the things that's really good to do if you're stuck in your head all the time is to just notice the feelings in your body from your toes to your knees to, do I feel heavy? Do I feel light? Just acknowledge any anxiety there or busyness or hurriedness. I listen to the sounds around me. I feel the temperature of the air. I feel where I connect with the seat. So in all of that, what I'm really doing is just saying, God, this is the moment that you've created me in. Like, this is the moment you're in and I'm in. I'm just going to land myself there. And that all helps to bring you out of the mind. And then I'll do one or two things. I sort of created this prayer thing for myself, realizing that I was struggling to get out of my head. I call it the elevator. And so I literally imagine there being an elevator in my brain, and I open it up.
Mm-hmm.
I put all of my thoughts in there. It could be emotional thoughts. It could be busyness of life. It could just be the rage. I put it all in there. I close the elevator, and then I just imagine sending it down through the back of my neck, through my throat, down past my
Mm-hmm.
shoulders, into my chest cavity, into my heart. Then I push the button again, it opens up, and I let those thoughts out. I imagine them going into my heart. So I'm not pushing them away and rejecting them. I'm
Mm-hmm.
just saying, I'm bringing you down. And then from my stomach or my heart, where I imagine I'm existing, I just say, God, here I am. I'm available. And so that's sort of how I enter
Mm-hmm.
into that space to try and bring my thoughts down into my body. But I would say on top of that, we are thinking beings, we have minds, and that's a gift of God. So we are going to think, we are going to struggle some days more than others. And the best thing to do is just to simply say,
Mm-hmm.
I see that, and then say a centering word like love or God or whatever, and just accept that our minds are going to do
Mm-hmm.
that and have compassion on it. So I think those, in the particular moments of prayer, those are things that I do. I breathe deeply for a while, which calms my nervous system
Mm-hmm.
down. I focus on my surroundings and become present to God. I imagine bringing my thoughts down into my heart, and then I pray from that center. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Is that kind of helpful? I'm not
It's so
sure.
good. Yeah, that's perfect. I mean, here's the thing. I think a lot of, when people sit and listen to you or they listen to John Mark or they listen to sometimes even me, because I've been told this, that it's like
Mm,
it, it sounds like you're like a monk living in the dead. Like I live in
mm,
the suburbs of Chicago, Karrie. Like, how am I
yeah,
supposed to? So I always feel like it's to humanize your experience is
mm,
so helpful for people. Like Strawn is a everyday guy who
yeah,
struggles and who has to center his body, and there are practical things that you do to help make it's not just like you're walking around and then and you're just in your zen all the time. I mean, like,
yeah,
there's like you
yeah,
have
totally.
kids and you are doing
Yep.
dishes, and you know what I mean. So I
Yeah.
think just to hear those practical ways, and I have to be very, very intentional. I actually do my prayer time with the Lord in my car, because
Mm,
it's where it's warm, and I have music and I can play it as loud as I want, and so it's just become my routine. Every morning I go and do that, and there is time for me. I call it the flushing, and it's just the morning where I sit there and it's just quiet, and then the thoughts that come, I'm not flushing them away, but I'm flushing them into my body. Like, just kind of like,
yeah.
but so I'm like, okay, that's there. What does that need
Mm,
to say? What does that need to
mm,
say? And a lot of it is just like, Lord, I'm here. And I'll be sitting there in like contemplative prayer. And then all of a sudden I'm thinking about my grocery list. And then I'm
yeah.
thinking about, what I have to do later today. And that has always felt like, I think at the beginning of this process of learning a lot of this, and maybe you could speak to this, but for me, it was like, oh man, I'm getting this wrong. Like,
Yeah.
I should be able to last 30 minutes in contemplative prayer. And like I was lasting like two, and then it was
Yeah.
like then 10 minutes, or whatever. And in those moments, my mind would be flooded by my grocery list or whatever. And what I began to see is that this was really the invitation of my humanity coming before the Lord, of just like,
Mm,
Lord, your servant is here. I'm listening, and just to redirect my
mm,
thoughts. And so when I hear you say those things or someone's listening, I think it's really powerful that for them to hear your human part of
mm,
sitting in the divine, right? Like, there's
mm.
just such a
Yeah.
human part of that
Oh
that
man.
that
I
makes
mean,
it relatable
it's
anyway.
yeah, and I think this is there's so much work to be done, I think, in many of our Protestant churches to fully understand what the incarnation is and what it means
Mhm.
that Jesus became like that the word became flesh and didn't just pretend to be human, but literally became human in every capacity. Because I mean, just standing back a little, we think God made us so that we have to eat, so that we procreate to populate the earth, and that we need to work. I mean, those things, that's not a result of sin. That's not like a fall issue. You know what I mean? This is how we're
Right.
made. And then he made the world to need cultivating. He made culture to need cultivating. So at a fundamental level, if prayer is about exiting that, to me, that makes little sense why God would create us this world that is so richly engaging and then say, okay, now in order to be close to me, you have to remove yourself from it. So I think the invitation there is
Oh, that's
is
good.
exciting. It's like, okay, well, how can we then live in God in the world? And I mean, I know that you're really you're passionate about honesty, and I think what I hear in some of what you're saying is the sense of actually it's just living openly, nakedly, and honestly with God. And I think for me in prayer,
Hmm.
generally during the day, what that looks like is, oh God, I just yelled, I was just really irritable at my kids just then. And it's just like, you saw that and
Hmm.
you know it and you love me anyway. And I'm grateful that you're a better father than I am. You know, it could just be, like sometimes I'll do something really embarrassing. I'll tell a joke or something, or sometimes you go to shake someone's hand and they're not, they don't quite get you. In those moments, I laugh and I laugh and I go, you saw that, God, and I just it's this
Mm.
nakedness before God that isn't necessarily about sort of ethereal experiences of transcendence all the time. It is this ordinary life that I'm learning to just live it as if God was always attentive, so that I might always be attentive to Him. And that means too saying,
Mm.
God, my life is a mess. I'm a mess. Like today I am anxious. I'm shaking. I'm freaking out. Just yesterday you promised me something and today I've already forgotten it. Like I'm hopeless. I'm just like, and it's just, and saying, but I cannot stop you intermingling with my existence. And therefore, would you just be
Mm.
present to this with me? And so I think there is an element in which our humanness and this ordinariness is to our advantage, because even our brokenness
Mm.
becomes a platform for opening up to God, as long as we see His desire to be with us there. And I think that's the key, is that if we feel that our failures and our mistakes or our inability to get it right push God away, prayer becomes exhausting and,
Mm.
and kind of overwhelming. But if we just see that God is there anyway, that He's just there, present in our darkest places, and that all we need to just say is, I know you're here. I know you see. I love you. Be with me. Then prayer
Mm.
just simply becomes
Mm.
about turning our attention toward God in every moment of our lives and days. And I mean, years ago, and sorry, I know I'm talking on a bit. I'll just finish with this little thought. But
I
years
love
ago,
it.
I heard this just crazy thing where someone said, if you're going to sin, sin with God, which sounds like the most stupid. When you hear it, you're like, that
Mm.
makes zero sense theologically or just anything. I didn't
Mm.
understand it at the time, but I think what I've come to understand that to mean is that if we're going to just be in our mess, in our brokenness, if in a moment we're just weak and we give into it and we're there, just do it in an awareness and openness to God. And I can almost, in my experience, what arrives isn't shame or guilt. It's actually freedom. It's the freedom of saying,
Mm.
I have nothing to hide. I am an open book to you, as Psalm 139 says. You know my thoughts even before I
Hmm.
think them, even my worst thoughts. And you say that you came to
Yeah.
reconcile all things to yourself, all things, meaning even this moment. And therefore, in my weakness, in my mess, in my brokenness, would you just be here? And it just lifts the
Mm.
darkness in the most amazing way. And I think that kind of honesty, that's what true prayer is to me, not necessarily breathing or the spraying the psalm. I mean, all that stuff's amazing, but all of that just brings us, elevates us to this place of complete nakedness before God. And I think a lot of people can
Mm.
access that nakedness quickly without all those techniques, purely by just their humility of saying, okay, I'm going to just let God in. And that's the dream. That's
Yes.
that's sort of the maturity of prayer, I believe, at least. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and the openness to say I want to let you into all of me, to all.
Yeah.
I think like when I read First Kings chapter 19 about Elijah and his utter like yelling out to God and just like, I have served you. I've been a zealot for you. I've done everything for you. And you've let
Mm.
everyone die. Now I want to die. And
Yep.
there is such rich beauty in that passage because as he is yelling, the depths of his own despair, he is in prayer. This is him
Mm.
praying. This is him praying to God. And he is praying with such guttural pain. And then he's so gutturally in pain that it wipes him out. He's tired. He lays
Yeah.
down and God in his goodness, because of that communion and like what you said, the friendship of God sends
Mm.
cake and water to
Yeah.
nourish him. He wakes back up and continues this repetitive prayer like 5 times or something,
Mm.
like several
Mm.
times he says the same prayer over and over again. And I think like even in that, okay, I'll be honest with God in my prayer, but it's just going to be this one time. And I'm really upset at like a level 10, but I'm only going to bring it like at a level 2 because,
Yeah.
I don't want to be offensive to God or whatever. And I'm not saying be heretical or anything, but what I am
Yeah.
saying is there is such, I mean, Elijah didn't have to die. So there's something going on with Elijah and God that's pretty stellar, right? Like
Yeah.
Elijah's
Yeah.
doing okay. He's like one of the most well-known prophets, right? And
Yeah.
yet his most guttural moment was his prayer of honesty. And it didn't end with just one prayer of just, here's
Mm.
where I am. And it was continual, and God continued to give him nourishment. And then, and then it even takes us into the prayer, of course, in the garden where
Yeah.
Jesus is asking multiple times in prayer of
Mm.
like, I don't want to do this. Is
Yeah.
there another way? And so all of what I hear you saying is this, that it is really this honest place of allowing our humanity to meet the deity of God right here on earth, which is inexplicable. Like it's wild. It's just wild if we would
Yeah, it
allow
is.
ourselves to really show up
Yeah,
honestly.
it is. And I mean, what I love about that prayer that you're talking about with Elijah is that what it shows us is that God is more interested in honest relationship than performance, because it takes a lot of
Hmm.
courage to say to God, "Hey, I've been doing all this, mate. I'm a little human prophet, but I've been doing all this and I'm that, and you ain't coming through." I mean, for him to say that to God requires the greatest, it's either insane courage and stupidity, or maybe Elijah knew something about what God deeply desires, that God actually deeply desires a true
Mm.
relationship. And any human being knows this. You talk to someone who only tells you what you want to hear, it's not a friendship, it's not a relationship. That's just fantasy.
Right.
The real relationships are where
Right.
you can bear all and be as ugly as you want to be to someone, and they turn around and go, I know you. I know the best parts of you, and I know that that
Mm.
what you're saying now and all this ugliness, that's not who you are. And instead,
Mm.
though, what I think most people do with prayer is they perform to God. They shelter their
Mm.
language. They speak what they think God wants to hear, and they give God a facade. Now, if we give God a facade, all we will get in return is God loving our facade. He will only be able to love what we give him. But if we give God our truest
Mm.
self, our deepest self, all of ourselves, then he will be able to love us in our deepest thing. And I feel like so much of us don't experience the love of God because we are just not naked enough with him, and not honest enough. I mean, in my hardest years of being sick, I would crawl up on the floor and I would literally
Mm.
just be yelling, God, what on earth are you doing? I blame you. I mean, I was exactly like Elijah.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be like, you tell me you're
Mm-hmm.
good, and I can't play with my kids. I can't feed my family. My body is broken. I'm having like 5 panic attacks a day. I'm overwhelmed. I'm not sleeping. And I'm spending thousands on doctors. Where are you? Who are you? How can you tell me you're good? And
Mm.
I'm just going for it. And you know what? Every single time I prayed that way, I would finish,
Mm.
and then the most remarkable peace would visit me. And that peace wasn't
Mm-hmm.
answers, it wasn't anything. It was purely, it felt to me like God saying, finally, finally, you're being honest.
Mm-hmm.
Finally, we can talk now. Now is when we get to actually have a relationship and rebuild. And it took me years
Mm.
of learning. And I used to wake up every morning and prayer journal, And I would just be honest. I would say, God, you know, I wouldn't hold my punches any longer. And what I discovered was that that would actually build intimacy. In fact, I'm sure I know I said offensive things to God, but when my kids say offensive things to me, I don't think to them, "Oh, I
Hmm.
must smite you now." I just think, "Wow, I can see you're expressing powerful emotions. You're feeling a lot, and you can't understand right now what I
Hmm.
can understand as your father, but I know you love me, and I'm just going to hold
Mm.
you in this moment." And that's what I felt God doing to me. And so I feel like if we take that Elijah story, what it is an invitation to is to non-performative prayer and to fearless prayer,
So
that
good.
aims more at
Hmm.
God's heart than it does at his sort of theological framework. And that can be scary for a lot of people, and I understand why. And I'm not advocating for just, you know, heresy and all the rest of it. But I would argue that honesty and vulnerability is a greater value to God than perfectionism and
Hmm.
theological acumen. Otherwise, he wouldn't have come and made a
Hmm.
bunch of teenage boys his disciples and apostles. He wouldn't have visited, he wouldn't have, the early church, the early church was primarily 70, 80% women. He
Yeah.
intentionally avoided the sort of the class intellectuals of the day and the guys with the PhD or whatever we would call, and he wouldn't have done that if he
Right.
wanted smart folks with theological acumen. He would have, So I think vulnerability and honesty are key.
Oh, it's so good. And I mean, I always say all the time that Jesus had the worst business plan to like
Yeah,
building the kingdom because, you would think that you would go to the most influential, but he built his kingdom from the ground up. And I know I'm so thankful for it because if it were to be the smart ones, the rich one, I just would be out. I'd be out. And then that would be
yeah.
stinky because I want to be in with the Lord. And it's so good what you're saying. Like, here's the thing. As you're talking, I'm kind of like, well, would you even be heretical or would you move to heresy if you were really being honest with God? No, it will always draw you to deeper intimacy. It's when we move away from the reality of our true heart and meeting with God that we move into religious context and into,
Mm,
actually a spirit of religion or heresy that moves us into that
yeah.
place. It's not when we're honest, it's when we're not honest. And so the fear of going, what will happen? I get it too. I mean, what I do for a living is sit in people's stories. There's reason why
Mm,
we act the way we act. There's dynamics at play, and there's generational dynamics at play and cultural dynamics and all of these things. But everyone knows that there is something in them that longs to be held in their darkest place. It just, we
yeah.
all have it. It's somewhere in us. And I think what you're saying is, or what I hear you saying is prayer unlocks that piece of our deeper longings that we can't even, that we can't fix. We can't put our full hands around, but there's still a longing to have it be held, which then makes
Mm.
me ask the question for you. Like, what were you always this like, prayer guru, or were you like what made you become someone that cared so much about prayer, and really has this become something that you are very passionate about?
I mean, I'm passionate about this precisely because of what I'm saying, because I felt like I spent a significant part of my life thinking that prayer, like finding prayer tiring and essentially performing for God in that space. And when I realized that prayer was as
Mm,
simple and easy as just living open before God and being present to God and welcoming God into these sorts of unlovable places within me, I felt like I've refound the gospel. And I realized that, man, so much of us are
mm,
living like in our heads, trying to get this right. And we're missing out on the greatest gift, which is simply to live a life with God. So for me, it's
mm-hmm,
prayer is the gospel. It is union with God. It is a life engulfed in Him. And I think that when you sit down with, like, when I've sat down with people and helped open their eyes and hearts to see that God is with them already and that they're not waiting, it is
mm,
just like a load lifts. And I think, especially for people suffering anxiety and depression, chronic illness, all of that stuff that's part of my story, I think prayer is the answer. And by prayer, I don't mean probably what most people mean. I simply mean coexistence with God, complete, open,
so
unashamed,
good.
love receiving coexistence with God. And I think that's worth giving my life to.
All right. So you wrote a book called Beholding,
Mm-hmm.
and I would love to know just kind of how did this book come to be, and what is this book Beholding? What is this book for people?
Yeah, so I mean, after all these years of sharing prayer, and I've written 3 prayer books, which are really poetic invitations uh, to that sort of honest and real place with God, but they're more devotional, and I'd really
Mm-hmm.
felt like, man, I'd love to share a bit of the story of my own life and how I came to this place, but also just some of the historical story and some of the techniques and ways of engaging in this. And really, for me, like when I started writing it, I'd actually called it an invitation to renewal in our moment, because I feel that for me, if we can renew and transform
Mm-hmm.
this aspect of the church, I think it will have massive ramifications for a lot of the crisis we're experiencing in our moment, just generationally, but also
Mm.
in the church. And so I wanted to write, yeah, a manifesto that was like, imagine if, imagine if we could see
Mm.
God in this way, experience Him. Here's the story of my life. Here's a little bit of history on it, and here's a way of approaching that. Maybe this could actually bring the transformation we so deeply desire. So Beholding was it actually just started out as an essay, and it got passed on to a few people and grown, and then it went to John Mark Comer to write it forward, and he said, I think you should talk to my publisher, and then I ended up talking to and it ended up as a book completely by accident. But it is this book about gazing into God lovingly as He gazes lovingly back into us, and the radical transformation that has on us, our families, our culture, our church life. And it's an invitation to renewal.
So, so is it a book? Is it a devotional? Is it prayers? When I get this, is it what am I going to be getting?
So yeah, this one is a book. So this is your classic nonfiction. So my prayer books are devotionals, but
Okay.
this is a nonfiction. It's sort of part memoir, part describer. There's sort of I go into a couple of techniques that you can use in your own life, how to pray. One's called the window of the soul. Others are kind of like watching and
Mm.
listening prayer. I talk about how it affects how we love others. I talk about bringing the love of God into our bodies. I talk a lot, actually, in one of the chapters at the end of the book. I talk about praying with our bodies and what that means. So I kind of like just go into all of this and
Mm.
invite people into this new way of seeing. Yeah,
I love it. I love it. And there's so much even what you've given here in this podcast to help people understand, just to bring the theoretical into reality, and like, how do I
yeah,
sit in that? And a lot of what I'm seeing from your book is there is a lot of that, of like, how do we actually sit in this? How do we actually
mm,
engage in this, and why? And that's, I think that's always just so good for people to understand that get your hands on something that's going to be a practical guide to you, to really help you understand what does it mean for God to gaze upon you and for you to gaze upon God.
yeah,
It's just a beautiful word is the word gaze. I mean, there's just something
yeah,
so intimate and beautiful about that, and I love that. Like, okay,
yeah,
last thing I'm going to ask you is this. So we believe over here, out of the particularities of our pain kind of comes the particularities of our calling. It's shaped through the things that we've experienced, separate
mm,
from our giftings, but this like call that we have, we call it over here kind of like my hell no, not on my watch while I continue to let
mm,
this happen. Heaven yes, but hell no. And
mm,
so, Strawn, what would you say, like, what is your hell no, as you have breath in your lungs and you are here and you see the world and you're seeing it through the grid of your own experience, through your unique eyes, with the God who formed you? As you look at this world, what is your like, hell no, do I not, I just don't want to see this happen on the land, and so I'm going to
mm.
offer this to the world? What would you say that would be?
Wow, that's a great question. Feels like a big question. I think.
Yeah, it
I mean,
is, it is, I know.
I mean, I know what it is. I just it's figuring out how to articulate it. I mean, positively speaking, I am sold out for reviving the passionate heart of the church for belovedness and closeness with God.
Hmm.
So I guess my hell no would be hell no to this Christian life just being a going through the motion, distant thing from God, while we experience anxiety and existential disappointment, and like, hell no, let's not
Mm-hmm.
live a gospel that is always at arm's length from God. And for
Mm.
me, and the reason for that is because a transformational experience of God changes families, it changes abusive situations, it changes workplaces, it
Mm-hmm.
changes the environment. For me, it is the top of the stream. And to help people
Mm.
experience God not as master or only master, not only as, God or deity, but as intimate, as father, as,
Mm-hmm.
beloved. um, that's my dream. That's what I'm here for, and
Mm.
that truly is a, my sickness has probably brought me there in many ways.
Yeah. I mean, right. Like our out of the places of our pain comes this knowing that, and I always hesitate because it's not like, oh, well, God's doing good things through your pain. That's so dismissive and painful to say
Mm,
to people. And
mm,
yet there is something beautiful about God's presence in the midst of your pain. We're
yeah.
constantly saying over here, like, freedom is not the absence of pain. It's the presence of God in your pain. That
Oh,
is what freedom
amen to that.
is. And I think that there is something about you. You are a priest. You are a priest on this land. We have prophets and we have kings and queens, and then we have priests and priestesses that kind of make up the fullness of who Jesus is: prophet, king,
Mm,
priest. And I think that's so important for, there's those prophets that are telling us, there's a better way. And there's the
mm,
kings that are keeping the place in order and keeping care for the kingdom. And then there's the priests that provide sanctuary, just sanctuary for
mm,
the heart to be able to breathe, to be able to come back to our bodies, and to be able to sit and contemplate. A priest allows us to have time.
mm,
And time moves slower with a priest. And there's just something about that in our really busy world, and the demands of a queen or a king, and the pressure of a prophet. And yet the priest gives us time. And I think one of the beautiful things that you offer through what I hear you say, and through the portions of your book that I've read, that you're a man where you've had to sit in a lot of time and a lot of space, and your sanctuary has often been the debilitatingness of your body. And
mm,
there's something very visceral about that for those of us that encounter a priest. You allow us
mm,
time to breathe and to see God in a way that doesn't require a lot of demand, but it
mm,
requires us to come honestly. And so I just acknowledge that in you, brother, and what you're doing, and the voice that you have from Chicago, Illinois, all the way to New Zealand, to
mm,
say, our land is looking for priests. They're looking for priests and priestesses that will create sanctuary for the heart and for the
mm,
body. And so thank you for your good work on this land. I know it has come at a great cost. And so
mm.
thank you for
Thank
allowing
you.
that cost to be part of our healing. It is such a joy. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It's beautiful. Kind words. I appreciate it. It's been really lovely talking with you.
Hmm. Yeah, great. We'll see you guys next week. We'll be talking a little bit more about Lent. For those of you that listen to this podcast, we would love for you to share this, and we would love for you to review it and subscribe to it and do all those things that I barely know what they are. But you should do them because they're important, I think, for people to know about this podcast. And also just know, as you listen to this podcast, I pray that God's presence and his goodness and his grace would just fall upon your face, and that you would truly taste and see that he is good, and allow your senses to be overwhelmed by the wonder and the mystery of God that lives in you. We'll see you next week.